They say Mexico City never sleeps. Yet in the winter of 1892, there was a house on Tuba Street where silence was more terrifying than sound. Because when the screams did come, they didn't sound human. They sounded like something being unmade, as if innocence itself was being burned alive behind those elegant stone walls. And tonight, I'm going to tell you a truth buried under a century of denial. The story of Isadora Montalvez, the woman history tried to erase, Mexico's first true serial killer. But before we open this locked door together, I need you to do something. Hit like, press subscribe, and share this story with someone you know who thinks they can handle the darker side of human history. Because what you're about to hear is not a tale, it's a wound. A wound that never healed. Now I want to ask you directly, where are you watching this from? Comment your city, your state, your country below. Because stories like this aren't just about the past. They're about us, about you, and about the systems that let monsters walk free in the daylight. Imagine it. A mansion rising from the cobblestone streets, balconies of wrought iron, pink limestone glowing at dusk like a cathedral of wealth. To the neighbors, Isadora was a woman of refinement, power, and faith. To the church, she was a benefactor. To the hungry poor, she was a savior. But inside her gates, the air smelled not of roses, but of scorched iron. And those who crossed her threshold, the desperate, the orphaned, the forgotten, never walked out alive. The newspapers of the time called her La Señora Caridad, the Lady of Charity. But among the few who dared whisper in the markets, in hushed voices behind folded fans, another name grew like a curse. La Degoladora, the slasher. The terrifying part? Her crimes weren't committed in secret dungeons or alleyways. They happened under the protective shadow of the church, the police, and the ruling elite. She was a predator disguised as piety, a killer hiding in lace and rosaries. But here's the question that haunts the history books. How many children died in that mansion before someone dared to speak? Because the night the truth finally spilled, it wasn't the screams that gave her away. It was the silence. Silence, in its purest form, is not peace, it's suffocation. And in February of 1892, neighbors of Isadora Montalvez began to notice something unnatural about the quiet that hovered over her mansion. Children had been seen entering, young girls from the countryside, boys barely old enough to work, but no one remembered seeing them leave. At first, people ignored it. In Porfirio Diaz, Mexico, the upper class were untouchable. The police were not protectors. They were instruments of order designed to protect the wealthy and silence the poor. And Isadora knew this. She moved within that system like a queen on a chessboard, every step calculated, every gesture designed to disarm suspicion. But whispers spread. Market vendors spoke of a carriage that arrived in the dead of night, carrying crates that never returned. The butcher's wife swore she had heard the faintest sound of a child crying when the wind shifted. A priest, after a private confession from a parishioner, mentioned in hushed tones that a woman of high standing was experimenting with sin in ways too unspeakable to name. The truth, however, was far darker than whispers could convey. Isadora had built her reputation by offering opportunity to the poor. Families from remote villages, broken by famine and disease, sent their children to her with letters of recommendation from priests who believed she was giving them a chance at survival. Instead, she transformed her home into what can only be described as a theater of suffering, a place where she studied fear as a scientist studies disease. But here is the forbidden truth the archives never want you to read. Her crimes weren't only acts of cruelty. They were experiments in control. She wanted to know how far a human mind could bend before it shattered. How many lies it took to make a child believe that pain was love, that obedience was holiness. The neighbors, of course, saw none of this. All they saw was a woman draped in black lace, clutching her rosary with saintly devotion. They saw her donate bread at church, bow her head in prayer, and speak in the kind of soft, deliberate voice that made people lower their eyes out of respect. But behind her mansion's heavy oak doors, children begged for mercy in voices no one ever heard, until one girl, half dead but unbroken, escaped. And when she spoke, Mexico trembled. Her name was Magdalena. Barely 15, thin as a shadow, her skin mapped with burns and cuts that told a story no words could fully capture. One freezing dawn, while the city still slept under the gray breath of mist, she slipped through the servants' gate of the Montalvez mansion. Her feet were raw, her body shaking with fever, but she ran, barely conscious, driven not by strength, but by terror, so deep it had become survival's final ember. She stumbled into the courtyard of a convent, collapsing before the astonished nuns. When they tried to lift her, she screamed at their touch, certain it was another trick, another game of pain disguised as mercy. It took hours before her words came, broken, stuttering fragments. The lady, she keeps them in the stone room. She says God asked for the blood. At first, the sisters didn't believe her. How could they? Isadora Montalvez was known as a patron of the church, a widow of refinement, a woman whispered about only with reverence. But Magdalena's body was a living testimony. The burns, the lacerations, the crude bindings still clinging to her wrists, they were evidence no piety could erase. One of the nuns, Sister Ines, dared to report the girl's condition to a parish priest. The priest, in turn, spoke to the authorities, but not without hesitation. To accuse a woman of Isadora's stature was dangerous. Power in Mexico City flowed not through truth, but through silence, patronage, and obedience. Yet the story spread anyway. Rumors, once fragile, hardened into conviction. Whispers traveled from pulpit to marketplace, from police barracks to government offices. A question pulsed beneath the surface. What if the Lady of Charity was not a saint, but a monster? Meanwhile, inside her mansion, Isadora already knew Magdalena had fled. Neighbors swore they saw her standing on her balcony that very morning, unmoving, her black veil rippling in the cold wind. She did not cry out. She did not hide. She simply waited, because she knew, when the authorities came, they would not find killer. They would find a house scrubbed clean, every trace of blood erased, every room perfumed with incense and roses. And when the police finally knocked on her door, she opened it herself, smiling as though she had been expecting them. But what they found inside would unravel the illusion of Mexico's first lady of piety and reveal the labyrinth she had built beneath her walls. The officers who entered the mansion on Tuba Street that winter morning carried themselves with the swagger of men accustomed to intimidation. They expected to find nothing, perhaps a frightened servant girl inventing fantasies, perhaps a minor misunderstanding that could be smoothed away with influence. But the moment the heavy oak doors closed behind them, something changed. The air itself felt wrong. The marble floors gleamed too perfectly, polished as though scoured to erase something. Religious paintings lined the walls, Christ's suffering, Mary's compassion, yet their frames seemed almost mocking in that house, their gazes cold and watching. The officers later admitted they felt as though they were intruding into a sanctum, one that rejected them even as it welcomed them. Isadora greeted them in morning black, veil draped delicately over her face, voice calm and serene. "Gentlemen," she said, as though hosting dinner guests, "please come in. I have nothing to hide." At first, they found nothing unusual. The kitchen was orderly, the servants' quarters clean. Yet one young officer, barely 20, noticed something strange, the faint scent of iron lingering beneath the perfume of incense. He followed it down a narrow corridor, past locked doors that Isadora insisted were storage. When they demanded a key, her smile never faltered. "I do not think you want to see what lies behind those doors," she said softly, almost motherly. But her refusal only deepened their suspicion. Under pressure, she relented, handing over a heavy ring of keys. The first door opened onto a stone stairwell leading underground. The air that rose to meet them was damp, fetid, and laced with a metallic sweetness. Lantern light flickered on walls scarred by fire, chains, and nails hammered into the mortar. The officers descended in silence, each step heavier than the last, until they reached the basement. What they found was no storage room. It was a chamber of torment. Wooden beams stained dark with fluids long dried. A brazier filled with blackened iron rods. Ropes frayed from desperate struggling. And in the corner, a small pile of bones, too small to belong to adults. One officer dropped his lantern, the flames sputtering as it struck the ground. Another vomited against the wall. The youngest wept openly, muttering prayers under his breath. Isadora, standing behind them, watched with something between pride and amusement. "You see," she whispered, "discipline must be absolute. Even God demands sacrifice." But in that moment, the officers understood. They were not standing in a house of charity. They were standing inside Mexico's first slaughterhouse of innocence. And they hadn't yet uncovered her greatest secret. The bones alone would have been enough to damn her, but the basement held more than remnants of the dead. Behind a second locked door, tucked deeper into the foundation, the officers discovered something that froze their blood more than the pile of skulls ever could. The living. 3 children, emaciated, trembling, their eyes enormous in the lantern light, huddled together in a corner. Their skin was laced with burns and whip marks, their ribs protruding like cages straining to hold in fragile life. At first, they recoiled from the officers, mistaking them for more tormentors. Only when one knelt, whispering prayers and holding out his hand, did a boy, no older than 12, creep forward, whispering a name that would echo in the reports. "La Señora, La Señora," said God wanted us broken. The youngest, a girl of perhaps 7, had been gagged so often she could barely form words. She carried instead a piece of charcoal in her fist, with which she had scrawled desperate shapes across the wall. Crosses, eyes, and words half-formed in childish handwriting. "Uda, perdón, Mama." The police were no longer skeptics. They were witnesses to something beyond crime, something ritualistic, systematic, as though cruelty itself had been elevated into a doctrine. And standing behind them, Isadora Montalvez did not flinch. She simply tilted her head, veil slipping to reveal the faintest smile. "Those children are liars," she said calmly. "Ungrateful wretches. They were brought here to be reformed. I did what their parents begged me to do. Discipline, correction, cleansing." But her words only deepened the horror, because the files recovered later showed meticulous records, names, ages, dates of arrival. Each child cataloged like livestock, each disciplined session recorded in her precise handwriting. This was not madness alone. It was bureaucracy wrapped in piety. Still, even as officers led the children out, even as words spread across Mexico City, a shadow of doubt lingered among those in power. Could they truly accuse a woman of such standing, a patron of the church, a figure whose donations had built chapels and fed priests? To destroy her would mean shattering the illusion of order the regime so desperately clung to. And yet, the truth was now out. The mansion was no longer just a house. It was a crime scene, a mausoleum of terror. But the real question, the one that haunts history, isn't how many children Isadora killed. It's why she did it. Because in her journals, hidden beneath floorboards in a locked chest, lay the explanation, and it was more disturbing than anyone expected. The journals were discovered only after hours of searching, hidden beneath a floorboard in Isadora Montalvez's private chamber. Bound in cracked leather, the pages smelled of mildew and incense, as though they had absorbed the atmosphere of both church and crypt. What the officers found inside was not the frantic scrawl of a madwoman. It was the chilling logic of someone who believed her cruelty was sacred duty. Each entry was written with meticulous precision. Dates, names, punishments, outcomes. She documented the effects of starvation, the breaking points of will, the exact number of lashes required to silence a scream into submission. But interwoven with these cold calculations was something even darker. Theology. Isadora wrote of visions, of voices that whispered from crucifixes late at night. She claimed the saints themselves had commanded her to purge corruption from the poor, to break children so their souls might be offered pure. In her mind, she was not a murderer, She was a vessel of divine instruction, a surgeon cutting away sin with fire and steel. One passage in particular struck the investigators with a horror that lingered long after the trial. The flesh resists, the mind resists, but the soul, once it tastes suffering, becomes obedient. Each child who bleeds in my care is a hymn, each scream an offering. I'm not their destroyer, I'm their redeemer. And one day, Mexico will thank me for saving it from the weak. The implications were devastating. This was not random cruelty. It was a philosophy, a system of belief that justified torture as purification. She saw herself not merely as a woman, but as an instrument of order, reshaping the world from her basement altar. The officers who read those pages refused to speak of them in detail. Some resigned. Others drank themselves into silence. One reportedly whispered, "If she is mad, then madness is colder than reason itself." Yet what shook Mexico most was not the discovery of her philosophy. It was the realization of how long it had been protected. For years, officials, priests, and neighbors had ignored the whispers, blinded by her donations, her influence, her perfect facade. The journals didn't just reveal her crimes. They exposed the rot within the institutions that shielded her. And though the journals should have sealed her fate forever, they instead ignited a storm of debate, because half the city wanted her burned, while the other half insisted she was too important to fall. But then came the trial, and in that courtroom, the full theater of her power was unleashed. But while the children's presence filled the Blackthorn estate with faint echoes of laughter and muffled cries, the world beyond those walls remained oblivious. Ravenshade, a town accustomed to gossip and whispers, seemed willfully blind to the signs that something darker was festering within that sprawling house. It was not that the townspeople lacked suspicion. Indeed, many noticed strange details. The Blackthorn carriages were seen arriving late at night, their lanterns extinguished, wheels rolling silently down cobblestone streets as if commanded by unseen hands. Servants came and went, but few ever stayed for long, and those who left rarely spoke again. And yet, no one dared to confront the family directly. Part of this reluctance came from fear not only of the Blackthorns themselves, but of the power they seemed to wield. When disputes arose in Ravenshade, land conflicts, property squabbles, or accusations of theft, the Blackthorn name was often invoked, and suddenly those quarrels dissolved. Magistrates dropped cases without explanation, families withdrew complaints, and silence once again reclaimed the streets. It was as though the Blackthorns were shielded by something greater than mere wealth. And then there were the children. No one knew where they had come from. They bore no resemblance to the Blackthorn line, and yet they lived within those walls as if claimed by blood. Rumors swirled like storm clouds. Some whispered they were orphans taken in by misplaced generosity. Others claimed they were purchased in secret auctions, exchanged like cattle under candlelit contracts. But the darkest whispers suggested something worse, that these children were not chosen, but harvested, taken from places beyond Ravenshade, their families silenced, their origins erased. One chilling account came from a farmer who claimed to have seen one of the Blackthorn boys wandering the edge of the forest late one evening. The boy was barefoot, his clothes torn, his eyes wide and vacant, as though he were searching for something he could not name. When the farmer called out to him, the child bolted back into the woods, disappearing into the fog. The farmer never spoke of it again, at least not publicly. But in hushed tavern corners, he confided that the boy's wrists bore iron marks, as though shackles had once gripped his flesh. The silence of Ravenshade was not born from ignorance. It was cultivated, enforced, perhaps even purchased. For every voice that dared to speak, another vanished into obscurity. And all the while, the Blackthorn estate stood tall and unchallenged, its windows glowing faintly at night like eyes that watched and waited and never closed. By the winter of 1876, whispers of the Donnelly family's strangeness had spread far beyond the isolated ridge where their farmhouse stood. Men in taverns spoke their name as if spitting out a curse, while women clutched rosaries whenever their children asked about the pale figures they swore they saw wandering near the tree line at dusk. The Donnellys were no longer just a family. They had become a symbol of something unnatural, a living embodiment of a flaw within the human design itself. But the deeper one looked into their history, the more sinister the truth became. Neighbors told of how the Donnelly children did not cry as infants. Their births were eerily silent. Their small lungs never wailed for air. Instead, their eyes opened wide, unblinking, and their gaze fixed on whoever held them. Mother said that these stares felt like intrusions into their very souls, cold, unyielding, and searching. Doctors who delivered them described their limbs as unusually elongated, their joints bending at angles that suggested an unsettling flexibility. To dismiss these claims as exaggeration would have been easy, but there were too many accounts, too many voices telling the same story. The oddities did not stop with their bodies. There were accounts of animals turning violent in the Donnelly presence, dogs snarling, horses bucking, cattle refusing to be led. In one incident, a neighbor's ox broke free and charged directly at the Donnelly children while they stood silently in the yard. Witnesses swore the beast stopped short, trembling, its eyes rolling back as if it had been struck by an invisible hand. The animal collapsed on the spot and never rose again. The children never flinched, never ran. They only watched, expressionless. Even their language was not like others. It was said they often spoke among themselves in whispers too quick and sharp for others to follow, a language of clicks and guttural tones. Those who overheard swore it was not Irish, nor English, nor any tongue they had ever known. The Donnelly children would fall silent whenever another human approached, as if carefully guarding their communication. But what unsettled the villagers most was their lack of fear. When fire nearly consumed their barn one autumn night, the Donnelly children stood in the blaze's light, unmoving, unafraid, as sparks fell against their skin without burning them. When asked why they hadn't screamed or cried, the eldest son replied with words that chilled those who heard them, "Fire does not belong to us." From that point on, the Donnellys were not just regarded as peculiar, they were feared. Something in their very existence felt older than human, something untouchable, something that gnawed at the edges of reality itself. The further investigators dug into the Hawthorne case, the more it seemed that Samuel was a walking contradiction, a boy who was both entirely present in this world and yet undeniably foreign to it. Doctors noted something else disturbing: his handwriting. Though barely 12 years old, Samuel wrote with the grace and precision of a man trained in advanced script. His notes, when analyzed, contained symbols and structures that did not conform to any known alphabet of the time. To those who saw them, they seemed like fragments of a forgotten language, or worse, the deliberate code of a culture humanity had yet to encounter. When questioned about the symbols, Samuel simply said, "They are reminders. If I write them, I will not lose myself here." This vague explanation only deepened the unease surrounding him. Some scientists believed he was inventing it, perhaps as a coping mechanism for trauma. Others argued that no child could fabricate such a system without external influence. To the villagers of Hollows Bend, however, none of this mattered. To them, Samuel's writings were curses, marks that poisoned their fields, their animals, and even their children. It wasn't just suspicion, it was fear layered with desperation. A local farmer, Elias Renwick, claimed his crops withered after Samuel glanced at his fields. A young mother swore her child developed a fever the very night Samuel walked past their home. Fear fed upon fear, and the once cohesive town of Hollows Bend fractured. Families whispered in secret, preparing to take action against the boy they saw as an intruder wearing the mask of a child. Meanwhile, the newspapers capitalized on the hysteria. Headlines such as "The Boy Who Writes in the Tongue of Shadows" and "Is Hollows Bend Cursed by a Visitor Not of This World?" spread like wildfire across New England. Every sensational word fueled both the public's fascination and the town's growing paranoia. Scientists begged to keep Samuel under observation, but the townsfolk were losing patience. At the heart of it all was Samuel himself, calm, unbothered, and eerily confident. Witnesses said he never appeared frightened, even when townspeople spat insults at him or demanded he leave. Instead, he stared at them with an unsettling calmness, as though he pitied them, as though he knew something they did not. He once whispered to a priest who demanded his repentance, "It is not I who should repent. It is you, for what you will soon do." That warning would prove prophetic. For in just a few weeks, Hollow's Bend would become the stage of one of the most disturbing and unexplainable episodes in its history, an event that would silence some and haunt others for the rest of their lives. The day after, the town square filled with whispers, as if the very air carried the name Blackwell. What unsettled people most was not only Miriam's ability to kill, but her ability to vanish into obscurity afterward, as though the earth itself conspired to hide her tracks. Authorities searched the woods, scoured farms, even dragged parts of the river, but no body of her victims ever surfaced. Her cruelty left behind silence, not evidence. Some said she carved symbols into the trees near where she struck, markings shaped like crooked crosses and serpentine coils. To the untrained eye, they were scratches. To the fearful, they were warnings. Parents began forbidding their children to walk home after sunset, and husbands forbade wives from venturing to the well alone. Fear wasn't confined to the Blackwell household anymore. It infected the entire town. What makes this moment in history so chilling is the psychology at play. Miriam didn't need a strike every night. She simply needed to remind the people of her presence, to plant the seed of paranoia so deeply that every footstep in the woods, every knock on a cabin door, sounded like her return. And in this way, she achieved something greater than murder. She created obedience. The very authorities tasked with capturing her seemed hesitant, reluctant even, as if they feared becoming her next target. One farmer's testimony still survives, scrawled in the pages of the family Bible. He claimed Miriam approached him at his barn, her hair wild, her face streaked with ash and blood. She asked him if he believed in God, then told him that God had long abandoned this land. "I am the punishment left behind," she whispered. The man said she laughed as she walked into the night. He sold his land the very next month, unable to remain. The Blackwell tale begins shifting here from a story of murder into something much darker, a test of how far fear itself can enslave a community. And as the stories grew, so too did the legend. Was Miriam merely a cruel woman with a lust for death, or had she tapped into something that transcended mortal cruelty? By the winter of that year, the question no longer was who will stop her. The question had become far more haunting. Who is protecting her? By the dawn of 1839, the town of Blackridge was no longer a place of progress, but a hushed prison, ruled not by walls or soldiers, but by the memory of a woman who seemed untouchable. The question on everyone's lips, though few dared speak it aloud, was simple. Who was shielding Miriam Blackwell? For every attempt the authorities made to track her, it ended in failure, not merely because of her cunning, but because someone always seemed to warn her first. A constable would speak of setting out at dusk, only to find Miriam gone by dawn. A raid planned in secret would end with her trails swept clean, her shadow already vanished. She was always one step ahead. This was no accident. Miriam knew the weaknesses of the human heart, and she exploited them with precision. Men in power, landowners, preachers, merchants, were not immune to her charm. She had once been the daughter of a prominent household, and those who remembered her beauty recalled it like a curse. Some whispered that even after her descent into violence, she could still entangle men with her words, her eyes, the strange fire in her presence. They said she promised them wealth, protection, even intimacy with forces beyond comprehension. And in return, they gave her silence. It is here that the tale of Miriam becomes less about the woman herself and more about the machinery that formed around her, a secret network of sympathizers, enablers, and conspirators who found use in her reign of terror. She was no longer simply Miriam Blackwell the killer. She was Miriam Blackwell, the symbol, the weapon. To some, she represented freedom from law. To others, a vessel of divine punishment. To a very select few, she was a tool of control. Evidence of this silent alliance exists in fragments. Letters with her name, half scratched out. Property records showing sudden land transfers to her kin. A preacher's journal confessing that he had baptized her in secrecy after her first killings, believing her violence to be a sign from God. These whispers reveal something damning. Miriam wasn't merely evading capture. She was being protected by the very pillars of her community. And so the story takes its most sinister turn. A woman with a blade can kill a body. But a woman with a following, hidden, unspoken, loyal, can kill a nation's faith in justice. Miriam had crossed into legend, and worse, into power. The morning after Samuel's first full day in the Hawthorne household was unlike any the family had experienced before. Dawn spilled across the parlor windows, gilding the old wood and fading curtains in pale fire. While most children would still be lost in heavy sleep, Samuel was already awake, seated cross-legged in the chair where he'd been placed the night before, his posture impossibly still, his gaze fixed on a point no one else could see. When Mrs. Hawthorne entered, carrying a tray of warm bread and milk, he turned his head slowly toward her. His eyes did not blink. "Did you dream?" she asked him, her voice softened with maternal instinct but pulled thin with dread. "Yes," Samuel answered, "but not like you dream. I dream awake. I saw the walls moving. The house is not empty when you sleep. They walk here between the cracks. They lean in when you breathe." Mrs. Hawthorne nearly dropped the tray. She could not tell if the boy was playing tricks on her or if he truly believed these words. But the way he spoke, monotone, calm, assured, gave no sense of fantasy. It sounded like truth, a terrible truth. Word of Samuel's strange declarations began spreading through the neighborhood. The Hawthornes, a family once regarded as modest, private, and respectable, were now being whispered about in the marketplace. Women clutching baskets of potatoes leaned toward one another, muttering, "That's the boy, the one they say doesn't sleep, the one who sees shadows." Children were warned to stay away from the house on Whitfield Lane, and fathers who once tipped their hats to Mr. Hawthorne now crossed to the other side of the road. But inside the house, curiosity warred with fear. Mr. Hawthorne began writing down Samuel's words at night, treating him as though he were a strange specimen. His journal filled quickly, fragments of speech about the dark under the ground, about the mouths that open in the walls, and about the watchers who love the sound of bones. Samuel seemed to speak not as a child, but as a historian of something older, something lurking behind the fragile veil of reality. One evening, when the wind howled through the chimney, Samuel turned to Mr. Hawthorne and said, "You are not the first to keep me here. You will not be the last. They always try to measure me, to explain me, but they never understand. They never last long." For the first time, Mr. Hawthorne dropped his pen. The realization struck him like cold water. This boy spoke as though he had lived through many households before, as though he had been here before, playing out the same cycle again and again. And the question that clawed its way through Mr. Hawthorne's mind was worse than any shadow Samuel described. If this was not his first home, where had he been before? The judge's gavel fell with a sharp crack that echoed through the wood-paneled courtroom, yet the sound did nothing to break the suffocating tension that had settled over everyone present. This was no longer a simple hearing of guilt and innocence. It had become a public theater of horror. Citizens packed into every available bench, craning their necks to glimpse the two figures seated stiffly in the dock, Miriam Blackwell and her son Elias. Their posture was not of broken criminals awaiting their fate, but of creatures carved from stone, unmoved by the murmurs, the gasps, and the weeping of those who claimed to know their victims. The prosecution delivered its case with fury, presenting evidence collected from the Blackwell home. Rusted shackles hidden beneath floorboards, a ledger written in Miriam's hand cataloging names and dates of disappearances, and a trunk containing clothing that belonged to people who had never been seen again. Each revelation sent ripples of unease through the crowd. Yet when Miriam was asked directly about these discoveries, she leaned forward with her ice-cold stare and spoke with unnerving calmness. "The dead never vanish. They remain exactly where I've left them. Elias, seated beside her, did not speak. His silence was not that of fear. It was a silence that vibrated with restraint, as though he were holding back a storm no one wanted unleashed. He never looked at the judge, never at the lawyers, never at the jury. His eyes stayed locked on the gallery, as if he were watching the people themselves, memorizing their faces one by one. A few witnesses swore they felt their hearts tighten when his gaze passed over them, as if an invisible hand had wrapped around their chests. The defense, shockingly, attempted to spin the narrative into one of misunderstood devotion. They painted Miriam as a woman scarred by loss, clinging to her son as her only anchor in a world that had turned against her. But such fragile arguments faltered against the mountain of physical evidence and the cold truth of Miriam's own words. Even so, when she was asked if she felt remorse, she merely smiled and said, "Remorse is a chain for the weak. I only ever kept what was mine." The jury's faces revealed their struggle, not with whether the Blackwells were guilty, but with the weight of condemning a mother and son who radiated something far darker than mere crime. This was not ordinary murder. This was not theft or cruelty born of impulse. It was ritual. It was doctrine. It was something ancient, woven into the very marrow of the Blackwell family. And as the judge prepared to hand down the sentence, a thought stirred among the townspeople. Would chains, walls, or even execution be enough to contain what Miriam and Elias truly were? The townspeople of Briarfield had long whispered that the sisters were not merely innkeepers, but something far more sinister. In hushed tones passed around tavern tables and church pews, they claimed that every traveler who disappeared had left behind an invisible mark, an energy that clung to the soil, to the walls of the inn, to the air itself. What unsettled them most was how quickly the sisters would recover from scandal. Each time suspicion grew, each time someone dared to speak too loudly of the missing guests, the Belladus sisters would shift the narrative. They would hold charitable gatherings, give food to the poor, and sponsor repairs to the church roof. It was manipulation as subtle as it was effective, transforming the image of predators into that of benefactors. The town began to depend on them, and that dependency became a prison. But beneath the surface, doubts never truly died. Mothers warned their children never to stray too close to the inn at night, for they said strange music played from within its walls when no one was meant to be awake. Some men swore they had seen carriages pull up at ungodly hours, with figures cloaked in black carrying sacks into the cellar, never to re-emerge. Yet fear kept most silent. To accuse the sisters directly was to risk retaliation, and in a town where the authorities looked away, no protection was guaranteed. The Belladus name carried power, and power, in a place like Blackvale, was more terrifying than knives or chains. One chilling tale passed among the townsfolk told of a young boy who had wandered near thee in one stormy evening. He claimed to have seen one of the sisters dragging a lifeless man by the shoulders into the ground cellar, her face illuminated by a lantern that made her appear more specter than flesh. The boy's parents silenced him, forbidding him ever to speak of it again. He grew up haunted by what he saw, and decades later, when the graves were uncovered, he broke down in sobs, confessing that he had always known something unspeakable was buried there. And yet, the sisters continued to walk among the townspeople with serene smiles, draped in their fine gowns, their hair pinned with ribbons. They played the role of hostesses so convincingly that even those who feared them the most found themselves lured by their warmth, their promises, their charm. The true horror was not just in what they did to their victims, but in how they convinced everyone else to look away. The more we peel back the layers of this story, the more it becomes clear this is not a disappearance rooted in chance, nor a tragedy born from accident. By 1891, Ashbourne was not just a town of stone walls, cobbled streets, and quiet Victorian civility. It was a nest of secrecy. The wealthy elite, cloaked in religious fervor and institutional power, held an iron grip over the population. And the wife of a millionaire was not merely a spouse. She was an asset, a figure tied into land, property, and bloodline. Her absence was not just a domestic matter. It was an earthquake that sent shockwaves through the hierarchy. Neighbors reported that in the weeks before her vanishing, she was seen walking the edges of the Ashbourne Cemetery, her figure shrouded in black despite no death in her family being recorded. Some said she spoke to the graves, her lips moving soundlessly as though reciting names no one dared to remember. Others believed she was being watched, her carriage stalked by a man in gray, always at a distance, always lingering until she disappeared behind wrought iron gates. Yet when investigators pressed deeper, what they uncovered was more than eerie coincidence. The convent outside Ashbourne, a crumbling Gothic structure maintained by an order of silent nuns, had records of her visits. But the journals stopped abruptly, the last entry a cryptic scrawl. She asked about the chamber. She should not have known. What chamber? To this day, the mention of it is enough to rattle those familiar with Ashbourne's buried history. Meanwhile, her husband, wealthy, influential, untouchable, moved carefully in public but desperately in private. He ordered the basements of his estate sealed, though no explanation was given. Workers who entered never spoke of what they found. Within weeks, those same men left town, abandoning families and trades, vanishing without warning. It was as though a shadow had spread over the town, swallowing the voices that might have told the truth. This wasn't simply the disappearance of a woman. It was the unveiling of a fissure in Ashbourne itself, a split between what the people saw on the surface and the black river of control and silence that flowed beneath. And what came next would confirm it. Her letters, found hidden inside the folds of a Bible at the convent, written in hurried strokes as though she was racing against time. They revealed not fear of her husband, but something far older. The villagers of Ravenshade had been taught to fear shadows, to avoid wandering too close to the Blackthorn estate, and to keep their children indoors after dusk. But fear is a fragile leash, and when whispers grew too heavy, someone always tugged against it. In the summer of 1878, the fragile silence shattered when a boy named Caleb Durns, only 14, dared to test the boundaries of the curse that had lingered for generations. Caleb was not like the others. He was reckless, defiant, and hungry for answers in a town where questions were punished with silence. He had heard the stories of the Blackthorn family, their twisted bloodline, their basement of chains, their terrible secrets. And while others shivered at the name, Caleb felt drawn to it. He would later claim that the estate called to him, its decayed roof and iron gates whispering promises no one else seemed to hear. One night, under the pale light of the moon, Caleb crept out of his family's cottage and crossed the uneven path that led into the Blackthorn woods. The trees leaned inward, heavy with silence, as if nature itself recoiled from the mansion that sat at the heart of the land. He carried only a lantern and a crude knife, the latter more for comfort than defense. The boy's heart thundered, but excitement outweighed fear. When he reached the gates, Caleb pressed his small hands against the rusted iron. To his surprise, they groaned open without resistance, as though the estate had been expecting him. The path that stretched before him was overrun with weeds, yet oddly clear in the center, as if countless invisible feet had walked it before him. The lantern flickered, fighting against the weight of the darkness. Each step forward seemed heavier than the last. What Caleb did not know was that others had tried before him. Each time, the town whispered of a boy or girl who vanished into the woods, swallowed by the Blackthorn curse. None had ever returned. Yet the pattern was always the same. The gates opened, the path cleared, the estate beckoned. As Caleb neared the mansion, its broken windows loomed like empty eyes staring down at him. A gust of wind extinguished his lantern, plunging him into the dark. That was when he heard it, soft, rhythmic clinking, like metal chains swaying in the wind. But there was no wind now. Caleb whispered to himself, a prayer, though he had never been a religious boy. He stepped closer to the door, which was already ajar. From the depths of the mansion came a voice, low and guttural, whispering his name. And still, he entered. The winter of 1876 deepened, and with it, so too did the paranoia that had begun to take root in Ravenshade. The Blackthorn mansion, once a symbol of wealth and distinction, had become an unspoken fortress of whispers. By now, the family's reputation was rotting like meat left in the open. Outsiders dared not approach, and those who lived nearby had begun to craft their own explanations for the grotesque transformations. Some said it was divine punishment. Others believed it to be the result of blasphemous rituals the family had conducted in the woods. Still others whispered of something older, something that predated Raven Shade itself, an ancient curse buried in the soil, waiting for the right bloodline to stir it. Inside, the Blackthorns had grown increasingly desperate. Food was stockpiled, curtains nailed shut, mirrors covered with cloth as if to hide from their own reflections. Dr. Alistair Gorin, one of the few medical men brave or foolish enough to enter the house, described the place as a tomb where the living eat alongside the dead. He noted how the children seemed to wither before his very eyes, their growth stunted, their skin tight and waxy. He claimed one of them spoke in a language he had never heard before, guttural and sharp, something that made his blood run cold. The townspeople, meanwhile, decided that science and medicine had no place in this horror. They returned to their own methods, burning effigies in the fields, chanting protective prayers at night, and marking their doors with ash and salt. Fear had infected Raven Shade itself, spreading far beyond the Blackthorn property. Even those who had never set foot near the mansion found themselves plagued by nightmares of chained children and distorted faces peering through windows. The family matriarch, Eleanor Blackthorn, is said to have held nightly gatherings in the dining hall, not for meals, but for readings, scriptures from obscure books not found in the church, texts bound in strange materials, and pages inked with symbols that none of the servants recognized. Some later claimed she was not reading at all, but summoning, reaching across the thin veil of existence to something no human should dare to touch. But Eleanor's efforts only seemed to worsen the affliction. The house shook at night with strange noises, the air grew thick and oppressive, and the children's deformities intensified. When the doctor attempted to intervene, Eleanor dismissed him with a chilling remark. "You think this is illness? No, doctor. This is inheritance." The idea that what plagued the Blackthorns was not a disease, but a destiny terrified the village more than any diagnosis ever could. The letters, once dismissed as the ramblings of grief-stricken townsfolk, began to take on a horrifying clarity when read in sequence. Each message seemed to respond to the previous one, as though a dialogue were unfolding, not between the living, but between those lost in Blackridge Hollow's soil and someone, or something, still bound to its cursed farm. Some letters carried sketches, crude charcoal drawings of chained figures bent in impossible postures, barns filled with rows of eyeless children, and shadowed figures watching from rafters. Others contained phrases repeated with obsessive urgency, lines such as "the blood feeds the roots," and "she makes them harvest in silence." The townspeople who dared to read these accounts aloud began to notice strange phenomena. Whispers carried on the wind that seemed to mirror their voices. Shadows stretched unnaturally long across the farmhouse walls, bending even when no lantern or sun should have cast them. Farmers complained of cattle refusing to graze near the fence line bordering the Blackridge property. Even the hounds, bred for hunting and hardened against wild threats, whined and dug their claws into the earth rather than cross the threshold of that land. And yet, there were always those who felt drawn to it. Young men seeking to prove themselves dared each other to step inside the farmhouse after dark. Some returned shaken, swearing that the rooms breathed, that the wooden beams groaned like ribs inside a living creature. A few never returned at all, swallowed by silence. Their families whispered that the land had claimed them, the way it had claimed so many children before. No funerals were held for these lost ones. No bodies were ever found. What disturbed investigators most were the reports that the farmhouse never decayed the way abandoned structures should. Its roof sagged, but never collapsed. The timbers rotted, but still bore weight. The windows, even when shattered, seemed to glisten with a strange wetness, as though the house itself wept when no one was watching. Men of science who attempted to catalog the phenomenon were mocked as sensationalists, but their private diaries told another story. They confessed to waking in the middle of the night drenched in sweat, hearing voices repeating the same words written in the letters. The blood feeds the roots. If true, then this was no ordinary farmhouse. This was a machine, a structure that demanded suffering to remain upright, a cage woven into the very land, built not to shelter, but to consume. And those who stepped across its threshold, knowingly or not, were part of its endless harvest. The deeper the inquiry into the Hollow Creek religious community went, the more it became clear that the disappearances were not random, nor were they isolated tragedies born of coincidence. By the late 1880s, the number of missing men, women, and children had risen into the hundreds, and yet, curiously, the surrounding townsfolk remained curiously silent. Families who had lost loved ones barely whispered about it. Those who dared speak were met with scorn, accused of blasphemy, or, worse, were marked by the community itself as traitors to the faith. Here was the paradox. The very people who should have screamed for justice had been rendered voiceless. But how? The answer, as documents uncovered later suggest, lay in a careful psychological web woven by the leaders of Hollow Creek. Every disappearance was explained away with a ready-made narrative. If a child vanished, it was claimed they were taken by God, chosen as sacrifice. If an adult disappeared, the community said they had run away from their holy calling. Every hole in the community's population was patched with dogma, and every scream for truth was drowned out by sermons promising eternal salvation, if only one accepted silence. This was not just faith, it was indoctrination sharpened into a weapon. Hollow Creek had mastered the art of creating fear without chains, obedience without walls. Those who obeyed felt safe, those who questioned were damned, and those who resisted outright simply vanished. But here's where the story grows darker still. Records indicate that outsiders who attempted to investigate, traders, local sheriffs, even traveling preachers, were also swallowed by the community. One sheriff's notes from 1889 reveal his growing suspicion of Hollow Creek's unnatural order, but the journal abruptly ends mid-sentence. He was never seen again, and yet, the missing were not forgotten. Quietly, some began to take notice outside the valley. A few brave men in nearby towns began to collect the names, to count the numbers. What they discovered horrified them. 312 vanished in just 27 years. Too consistent, too patterned, too deliberate to be dismissed as chance. This was no longer about faith, or even about control. It was about power, the kind of power that thrives on secrecy, that feeds on silence. Hollow Creek was not merely a religious community. It was something older, something parasitic, something that seemed less concerned with God and more concerned with feeding itself on human lives. The question that haunted those who studied these records was chilling. What could justify such a sacrifice? The deeper one delves into the chronicles of the Blackthorn family, the more one realizes that their horror was not confined to the four walls of their Ravenshade estate. Their influence seeped outward, corrupting officials, silencing priests, and bending the law to their will. The family wealth bought silence, but it was their uncanny ability to manipulate fear that kept them untouchable. By the 1870s, whispers spread through neighboring villages of missing farmhands, vanished children, and merchants who entered Ravenshade's shadow only never to return. Yet, curiously, no investigation ever penetrated the estate grounds. Each attempt ended in abrupt withdrawal, reports lost, witnesses recanting as though an unseen hand forced their compliance. But here lies the darker question. Why were so many willing to shield the Blackthorns? Some argue that the family held documents and secrets about the town's founders, records of rituals, blood pacts, and oaths sworn beneath hidden churches long before Ravenshade was built into a proper settlement. The Blackthorns in this telling were not merely criminals. They were keepers of something older, something so dangerous that exposure would have shattered the social and religious fabric of the time. It is here that Ravenshade's horror crosses into forbidden history. The suggestion that institutions, both local and national, preferred the Blackthorn's atrocities to the unveiling of truths buried beneath the soil. In the estate's cellar, according to a former servant's testimony, strange objects were kept, items that bore no resemblance to Christian iconography. An iron mask without eye holes, chains etched with symbols no blacksmith could replicate, and a bound volume written in a dialect no scholar could translate. These objects were not merely decorations. They were instruments, used in rituals where silence was enforced by screams. The servant claimed that during the midnight hours, villagers could hear a low, thunderous chanting that carried across the moors, only to vanish the moment someone drew close. What unsettles modern historians is how such accounts repeat with consistency across decades. Different witnesses, different times, yet always the same descriptions: chains, chanting, and children taken from their homes, never to be seen again. The Blackthorn estate was not only a house, it was a stage upon which generations of horror played out. And yet, perhaps most chilling of all, is that the town continued to thrive under their reign. Trade increased, wealth flowed in, and the Blackthorns remained the silent patrons of prosperity. Ravenshade was, in effect, purchased with blood. Each missing life, each silent scream, became a mortar for the town's success. The deeper you examine this balance of prosperity and corruption, the more unsettling the realization becomes. Perhaps Ravenshade did not merely tolerate the Blackthorns, perhaps it needed them. The night was eerily silent in Blackridge Hollow, broken only by the occasional whistle of the wind that pushed through the cracks of the old farmhouses. But inside the farmhouse of the Reddick family, silence was more than absence of sound. It was an oppressive presence, heavy and suffocating. Survivors of the ordeal would later describe how the house itself seemed alive, its beams creaking like bones, straining under unseen weight, its walls whispering like breath against the ears of those trapped within. Investigators, standing where the kitchen once was, noted something peculiar. The wood around the fireplace bore marks not of age, but of frantic scratching. These weren't the idle scrapes of a restless hand, but deep, ragged gouges made by nails, as though someone had tried desperately to claw their way out of the very walls. Some of the boards had even been partially pulled free, leaving gaps into which one could reach an arm, but never an escape. What, or who, had been trying to escape? The evidence suggested more than hunger or madness. It suggested imprisonment. When the sheriff's men finally descended into the cellar, they carried lanterns to break through the stifling dark. The flames flickered wildly, fighting to illuminate what the daylight above had long refused to touch. The chains, as previously described, were not simply for livestock. They were bolted into stone, thick and rusted, arranged in a manner that implied multiple captives. But the most unsettling discovery was not the chains themselves. It was what they found at the base of them: scraps of torn fabric, children's shoes, and bones too small to belong to any adult. Even more disturbing was the layout of the cellar. It wasn't just a storage place. It had been carefully constructed with alcoves, narrow enough to force a person to remain crouched or bent, as though deliberately designed for suffering. These alcoves were lined with straw that had long since blackened, brittle under touch. Burn marks on the stones suggested fire had been used, not to warm, but to punish. The sheriff ordered his men not to speak a word of what they had seen. One deputy, a man hardened by war, reportedly vomited on the spot and refused to re-enter the farmhouse. He left his badge on the table that very night. Word of this moment spread in whispers through the town, igniting speculation that would soon spiral into hysteria. But perhaps the most unnerving detail came from a lantern that flickered against the far wall of the cellar. As the light shifted, it revealed something no one had expected. Words carved into the stone, crude yet deliberate. A phrase repeated 3 times, scratched deep by trembling hands. "They feed us lies." The men froze. None dared to touch the inscription. The sheriff simply ordered them out, his voice unsteady, though he tried to mask it with command. That phrase would linger in the minds of those few who had seen it, haunting their sleep and leaving behind a singular, terrifying question: who was feeding whom? The elders of Hollow Creek called it a test of devotion, but for those trapped within, it was something far more sinister, an experiment in absolute obedience. By the late 1890s, whispers spread through nearby villages of children seen wandering the roads at night, pale and glassy-eyed, before being herded back by robed men with lanterns. Travelers spoke of eerie chants drifting from the hills, layered voices repeating words no one could decipher. Yet whenever officials tried to investigate, they were met with locked gates and carefully rehearsed smiles from community leaders, who insisted Hollow Creek was nothing more than a religious retreat. But the truth was unraveling. Records uncovered years later revealed an astonishing pattern. Every 7 years, exactly 12 members would vanish. Never spoken of again, their existence erased as if they had never lived. Locals believed these disappearances were ritualistic sacrifices, offerings to whatever unholy force Hollow Creek believed governed them. The most chilling part was the consistency. Not once in those decades did the cycle break. Always 12. Always in silence. What terrified outsiders most was how the remaining members responded. There was no grief, no mourning, no recognition. Families who had lost fathers, daughters, or siblings would behave as if nothing had happened. To outsiders, this suggested mass psychological conditioning, erasing memory through fear, through manipulation, through spiritual control, so suffocating that the human mind bent itself to survive. But others believed something more disturbing, that those who disappeared hadn't died, but had been transformed. Farmers spoke of figures moving through the woods, too tall, too gaunt to be human, walking with unnatural precision. Some swore they had seen skins stretched too tightly across skeletal frames, or eyes that glowed faintly in the moonlight. When these reports reached officials, they dismissed them as drunken superstition. But for those who lived closest to Hollow Creek, it was survival to believe. You stayed away from the fields at night. You never looked too long at the convent walls. And most importantly, you never asked where the missing had gone. It was during this period that the disappearances reached their peak. Nearly 150 souls lost in less than 2 decades. Their names vanished from records, their graves never found, their lives scrubbed from memory. Hollow Creek was becoming less a community and more a machine, feeding something unseen, something that demanded flesh, loyalty, and silence. And the silence was perhaps the most terrifying part, because silence wasn't simply compliance. It was complicity. The inquiry into the Hollow Creek religious community had, by this stage, transformed into something far more sinister than a case of mere disappearances. Documents began surfacing. Letters exchanged between leaders, financial records, and coded notes that bore strange symbols resembling both alchemical signs and occult diagrams. These weren't merely administrative files. They hinted at rituals cloaked in religious justification. Witnesses described gatherings where scripture was read aloud, not as prayer, but as command, words meant to bind rather than liberate. Survivors recalled the chilling uniformity of these sessions, the way candles were placed in precise geometrical patterns, the way participants were required to respond in unison, and the repeated chant of a phrase no outsider could ever fully translate. Those who attended spoke of the oppressive silence that followed, as if every voice had been swallowed by something waiting in the darkness. By 1879, an investigator named Clark supposedly infiltrated one of these assemblies. His writings, though incomplete, provide the most disturbing glimpse yet. He spoke of masks fashioned from animal hides, of processions led into a subterranean chamber beneath the chapel, and of a circle of submission, where each member was forced to renounce their individuality in exchange for the embrace of Hollow Creek. Clark's notes ended abruptly, his last entry scrawled in trembling hand. "The floor is breathing." Equally alarming were the testimonies of townsfolk who noticed changes in the land itself. Crops withered overnight. Wells produced water tainted with a metallic taste. And at twilight, faint chants could be heard carried by the wind across the valley. Some swore that the sound wasn't human at all, that it had a resonance deeper than any voice could reach, as if the earth itself was echoing back what was spoken in those rituals. This was not mere rumor or hysteria. When authorities attempted to confront the leaders of Hollow Creek, they were met with silence. Doors were barred, the chapel windows covered in cloth. And yet, through the cracks of those coverings, faint candlelight could be seen flickering at all hours. One sheriff, hardened by years of enforcing law on the frontier, claimed he had never felt fear like he did standing before that chapel door. He admitted he couldn't knock, that something in him resisted, as though touching the wood would bind him forever. It was then that the disappearances became undeniable. They weren't random. They weren't the work of an outsider. They were deliberate acts, rituals hidden behind scripture, sanctified by fear and protected by silence. The whispers about the Hollow Creek religious community had always been dismissed as rural superstition. Outsiders thought the locals exaggerated, embellishing with ghost stories and old folk warnings. But inside the valley, among the mist-choked fields and rotting wooden homes, the unease was real. Men refused to walk the dirt paths at night. Women closed their shutters before sundown. Children, when asked about the silence of Hollow Creek, would only say, "They don't come back." By the late 1890s, the numbers were undeniable. Farmers abandoned their land. Travelers who enter Hollow Creek did not emerge. Records of disappearances stretched back nearly 3 decades. 312 souls gone without trace. Not a single grave, not a single confirmed corpse, just names vanishing into the soil of the valley. The local sheriff stopped investigating after his own deputy vanished. State officials turned away, claiming the valley was curse ground, better left alone. And yet, the community remained untouched, operating behind its wooden palisades, guarded not with weapons but with silence. Survivors, few and scattered, spoke of ceremonies beneath the chapel, of black-robed figures chanting by torchlight. One merchant swore he saw children chained to pews as the elders raised knives in solemn rhythm. Another described hearing hymns at night, but twisted, the words bending into sounds no human tongue should form. Their testimonies were dismissed as madness or drink-induced hallucinations, but together they formed a pattern, a shadowy portrait of a faith that consumed rather than redeemed. The strangest detail was always the church bell. It rang at irregular hours, sometimes midnight, sometimes deep into the dawn fog, and each toll seemed to mark another disappearance. Farmers living on the valley's edges told of counting the bell strikes, then waking to find their neighbors gone. Was the bell calling them, summoning them, or was it signaling that yet another life had been claimed? But the most chilling account came from a boy named Elias Rourke, who escaped Hollow Creek when he was 12. His story was dismissed by authorities as the wild fantasy of a frightened child, yet his words still echo with dread. He claimed the community's leaders promised eternal life, not in heaven, but here on earth, through sacrifice. Each missing person, he said, was not lost, but given. Elias described vast caverns beneath the chapel, carved deeper than any mine, where a congregation sang to something in the dark, something that was not God. And when pressed to explain what he had seen, Elias whispered only, "They don't die, they change." The following morning, Ashbourne awoke to rumors louder than the church bells. Villagers whispered in doorways, their voices trembling with the weight of scandal. Some said Evelyn Ashbourne had been seen walking barefoot on the garden path the night before, her hair undone, her eyes wide with something between terror and madness. Others swore they heard carriage wheels creaking on the cobblestones at midnight, though no driver, no horses, and no carriage had been seen. The police patrol dismissed these accounts, but the rumors spread faster than truth ever could. Inspector Harrow, growing more desperate with every passing hour, ordered the grounds of Ashbourne Manor searched again. This time, no stone was left unturned. Servants were questioned brutally, hands trembling as they swore their innocence. Wine cellars were ransacked, attics opened, floorboards tapped for hollow sounds. Still, Evelyn was nowhere. What Harrow found instead was something stranger, something that tightened the noose of suspicion around the entire household. Inside a locked trunk in the master bedroom, they discovered several journals written in Evelyn's delicate hand. The pages were filled with cryptic musings, entries that blurred the line between dream and confession. She wrote of a darkness in the walls, of a voice that belonged to no man but spoke through every man. She described waking in the night to see her reflection move independently in the looking glass, smiling when she did not. Most disturbing of all was an unfinished entry, dated the very night she vanished. If this is to be my last evening, let be known I go not willingly, but the house will not let me leave. The inspector hesitated before releasing this discovery to the public. To admit it would be to invite hysteria. Already, Ashbourne Manor was acquiring a reputation as a place cursed, as though its stones were built not upon soil, but upon some ancient wound in the earth. Locals avoided passing by its gates after dusk. Mothers forbade their children from playing within sight of its windows. And yet, whispers persisted. Some claimed Evelyn had fled to escape her husband's grip. Others believed she had gone mad and thrown herself into the river that ran behind the manor, though no body was ever recovered. A few, bolder in their superstitions, claimed she was taken, not by man, not by water, but by the house itself. The truth, however, was far darker than even the rumors dared suggest. For hidden deep within the manor structure was something the family had buried long ago, something that had not been meant to be disturbed. The further the investigation delved into the life of Marybelle, the more unsettling truths surfaced, truths that even the most hardened men hesitated to speak aloud. At first, she was dismissed by the town's gossips as nothing more than a fragile woman who had been touched by misfortune. But as new evidence emerged, those whispers hardened into something darker. A possibility that Marybelle had not only been a victim of strange forces, but perhaps a willing vessel for them. Among the scattered belongings retrieved from her home in Daggermore were items that didn't belong in the possession of an ordinary woman. Journals, yes, pages scrawled with half-legible words, symbols, and strange diagrams. But alongside them were objects that seemed older than the town itself. Bones carved with runes, shards of blackened glass that hummed faintly when held, and a child's doll, hand-stitched, eyeless, its fabric stiff with age. Every one of these items suggested something older, something that predated her existence, perhaps even her bloodline. A physician who examined Marybelle's journals later confessed that what unnerved him most was not the drawings themselves, but the consistency of them. They were repeated circles, lines, configurations of stars and serpents, over and over again, always precise, always the same. As though she wasn't inventing, but recording, as though something was telling her how to write, forcing her hand to draw the same image until it became muscle memory. Even more unsettling were the accounts of townsfolk who had encountered her in her final months. One man swore he saw her speaking to someone in her empty parlor, her lips moving, her tones stern and commanding, yet the room was silent save for her voice. Another claimed she knew his daughter's name without ever having met her, whispering it with a smile that sent a chill down his spine. A farmer who lived on the edge of Daggermore said he once passed by her window late at night and saw her standing in front of a mirror, not gazing at her reflection, but arguing with it. The fear became unbearable when the townsfolk realized that many of the drawings in Marybelle's journals aligned with certain places in Daggermore: the church, the town square, the graveyard, as though she had been mapping the town itself, overlaying it with symbols no one could decipher. Some feared she had been preparing Daggermore for something, marking it, or perhaps cursing it. The doctors wanted to dismiss it all as hallucinations of a fractured mind, but the townspeople knew better. They could feel it in their bones, the way animals grow restless before a storm. Something was coming, something that had used Marybelle as its voice. And if her death had silenced her, what if it had only freed the thing that spoke through her? The shadows of the Beecham estate were no longer confined to its walls. They had seeped into the very consciousness of the town, binding everyone with invisible chains of fear and complicity. By 1948, Woolcroft was no longer a place of whispers. It was a place of silence. A silence so suffocating that even children, who naturally asked questions, instinctively knew not to mention the family by name. Parents taught them not through warnings, but through silence itself. An unspoken rule that the Beechams must not be acknowledged. This was not superstition anymore. It was survival. But behind this carefully cultivated silence, the town's leadership was collapsing under the weight of knowledge too terrible to ignore. The mayor's son had been one of the missing. The parish priest had seen something he would never confess, something that broke his faith. The police captain had resigned, citing illness, but those who knew him whispered that he had uncovered records, rail shipments, private deliveries, that suggested the Beechams were moving something or someone in and out of the estate under the cover of night. And then there was the matter of the ledger. Rumors spread of a book, meticulously kept by one of the family's elder sons, cataloging every transaction, every visitor, every disappearance. It was said to be locked away in the basement of the estate, a record not just of the crimes committed within Woolcroft, but of connections stretching across counties, states, even across oceans. If true, the Beechams were not just an isolated family of horrors. They were part of a wider system. In private, a few brave men formed a pact. They gathered in the back room of an old tavern, away from the ears of wives and children, and whispered about retrieving the ledger. They knew it was dangerous, that simply attempting to touch what the Beechams had created might mark them for death. But desperation can make men reckless. The plan was simple, though born of desperation. 2 men would distract the guards on the estate grounds, while another would break into the cellar where the ledger was rumored to be hidden. If they could secure it, they believed the truth could be forced into the open, exposing not only the family but those in power who protected them. But those who plan against darkness often underestimate how well darkness defends itself. The night they chose was stormy, rain pounding the earth as though the sky itself was warning them back. As they approached the Beecham estate, the gates loomed larger than ever, slick with rain, their iron bars like the teeth of a beast daring to be challenged. One man muttered that he had seen figures moving in the windows. Too many figures for a house that supposedly held so few. By dawn, only one of the men returned. He was soaked, trembling, his eyes wild with terror. He had no ledger, no proof. His tongue seemed paralyzed, as if something had stripped the words from his mind. He would live for only 3 more days before taking his own life. And the ledger? If it existed, it remained in the grip of the Beechams. The townspeople of Blackridge Hollow thought they had unearthed every horror the farm concealed. Yet in truth, the soil itself was still speaking. As the weeks passed after the arrest of the surviving family members, strange discoveries continued to emerge from the land. Artifacts buried deep beneath the farmhouse, remnants of rituals no one wanted to imagine, and evidence that suggested the killings were not random acts of cruelty, but part of something far more deliberate. Hidden within the foundation stones of the barn were strange carvings, symbols that scholars claimed bore a resemblance to ancient sacrificial markings, older than Christianity itself, as if the family had been preserving a tradition rooted in forgotten blood rites. The sheriff tried to dismiss these findings as the paranoid ramblings of outsiders, but whispers spread quickly through the town that the farm was not simply a place of murder. It was a temple. Every blood-soaked act had been carried out with precision, a devotion to something unseen, something the family believed demanded constant appeasement. It was not hunger that drove them, nor mere cruelty, but ritual obligation. Survivors who had spent time within the farm's walls described hearing guttural chants at night, echoing in the rafters, accompanied by the sound of knives scraping across stone. The townspeople became divided. Some argued that the family were nothing more than deranged killers, hiding behind superstition to mask their depravity. But others, those who had lived long enough to remember the whispered warnings about the land, believed the truth was far darker, that the farm had always been cursed ground, and the family were merely its servants. Whether willing or unwilling, they had carried out the will of something older, something rooted in the soil itself. As the years dragged on, the farm was left abandoned. Grass grew over the mounds where bodies had once been unearthed. The farmhouse, though gutted and burned, refused to collapse fully, its charred frame looming like the skeleton of a beast too stubborn to die. No matter how many times locals tried to reclaim the land, animals would not graze there, crops refused to grow, and storms seemed to gather unnaturally over the hollow. The place rejected the living, as though reminding them that it belonged to the dead. And so the legend of the Farm of Horrors became more than just a tale of a murderous family. It became a warning whispered across generations. Do not tread upon that ground. Do not awaken what sleeps beneath it. For the family may have been imprisoned, their crimes laid bare, but the hunger that drove them had not died with their capture. It still lingered, waiting in the soil of Blackridge Hollow. The events at Hollow Creek began to unravel in ways that no one could have predicted. By this point, the whispers had spread beyond the valley, carried into neighboring towns where travelers spoke of strange rituals, missing persons, and fires that burned in the woods with no clear source. The Hollow Creek religious community, once seen as an isolated experiment in devotion, had become the focal point of something darker, an institution that thrived not on faith, but on secrecy, control, and the slow erasure of truth. Reports surfaced that outsiders who tried to enter Hollow Creek rarely returned. Merchants who claimed they had delivered supplies were never able to confirm where the goods had gone, and letters sent into the valley disappeared without response. The few who did escape the grasp of Hollow Creek told chilling tales. Nights filled with chants echoing through the forest, masked figures wandering the fields, and children who stared with empty eyes, repeating phrases as if programmed by something greater than themselves. The disappearances themselves, 312 people across 27 years, were never documented officially. It was as though the valley consumed them, swallowing their identities, their records, their very existence. Families who went searching were turned away, told that their missing loved ones had renounced worldly ties and chosen the eternal path. The more they pressed for answers, the more aggressively they were warned to let go or face consequences. What unnerved investigators most was the level of organization. This was not a community lost in delusion or madness. It was structured. It had a system. Every ritual, every disappearance, every piece of information suppressed, it all followed a design. A chilling, precise architecture of silence. And at its core, a council of elders who seemed less like spiritual leaders and more like architects of control. Their names were rarely spoken outside the valley, yet their reach extended beyond Hollow Creek. Politicians, businessmen, and even church officials have been tied to them, though evidence was always conveniently buried. Those who dared to dig deeper began to suspect that Hollow Creek was not just a religious sect. It was a testing ground, a place where obedience, manipulation, and the slow erasure of individuality could be perfected before being applied elsewhere. The community became a crucible for psychological control, cloaked in the language of salvation. And the 312 vanished souls? They were not forgotten. They were the foundation. Their silence was the proof of the system's power. The true horror was not simply the missing. It was the realization that Hollow Creek had never been isolated at all. It was connected, feeding into something larger, something that stretched beyond its borders. And those who uncovered that truth found themselves marked, stalked, and warned to stop before they too disappeared. By now, the boundaries between what was myth, what was history, and what was forbidden knowledge had dissolved entirely. Every testimony about the Hollow Creek religious community no longer read like mere accounts of a secretive sect. They sounded like fragments of a coded gospel, deliberately constructed to obscure a much darker truth. Witnesses described the missing 312 not as taken, but as offered. Their absence was spoken of not in grief, but in ritualized silence, as though acknowledging them was itself a sin punishable by the unseen power that ruled the valley. What unsettled investigators most was the recurring presence of a symbol that appeared on stones, doors, and even scratched into the wooden pews of Hollow Creek's decaying chapel. It was a shape no one could fully agree upon. Some called it a twisted spiral, others a broken sun, while a few described it as the Ouroboros, the serpent devouring its own tail. But the accounts all agreed on one fact. Whenever someone spoke of the symbol, they grew pale, their voices lowering as though describing it aloud invited it back into their lives. That symbol, it seemed, was the community's true scripture, its essence carved into matter itself. The community's former members spoke of ceremonies that blurred the line between worship and erasure. In these gatherings, no names were spoken. Individuals were stripped not only of their worldly possessions, but of their very identity. To belong to Hollow Creek was to vanish in stages, first as an individual, then as a voice, and finally as a body. This, the sect taught, was the path to purity, a doctrine that turned human existence into fuel for an invisible mechanism of control. It wasn't religion in the traditional sense. It was annihilation masquerading as devotion. The frightening part is that the doctrine had no apparent leader. No one name emerged as the high priest or ultimate authority. Instead, leadership rotated, as though the group believed power itself should never settle upon a single person, but remain dispersed like a shadow stretching across many figures. That absence of a singular leader made Hollow Creek impossible to dismantle, because who do you arrest when there is no face to the corruption? Who do you indict when the system itself is the culprit? The implication was monstrous. The community did not survive on faith in one man or woman. It thrived on submission to the void. The missing 312 were not casualties of a single cult leader's madness. They were sacrifices to an idea, one older and more resilient than any institution that sought to bury it. And yet, hidden beneath this realization was a deeper terror, the whispers that Hollow Creek was not alone, that across the world, similar communities had existed, each vanishing silently, leaving behind only symbols, fractured testimonies, and a tally of the disappeared. The trial of Miriam Blackwell was unlike any other proceeding the county had ever witnessed. People traveled from neighboring towns just to catch a glimpse of her, as she was escorted into the courthouse, shackled, her black dress swaying like the robes of some ancient priestess of cruelty. They whispered, "There she is, the woman who hunted men as if they were animals." But Miriam did not bow her head, nor did she show any trace of remorse. Her posture was straight, her chin tilted high, and her eyes were as piercing as the day she first walked into the tavern. If anything, the iron bars and chains seemed to magnify her aura of dominance. The courtroom was divided in two, those who demanded her execution, and those who, strangely, were still under her spell. A few women whispered in admiration of her independence, her refusal to submit to the world of men. Others muttered that she was not a criminal, but a prophet sent to reveal the weakness of men through blood. And yet the evidence piled high against her. Accounts of her luring, killing, and disposing of bodies in shallow graves across the woods. Testimonies from survivors painted her as a predator with a smile that could disarm the wary and a voice that could hypnotize the strong. The prosecution presented her crimes in a chilling sequence. The poisoned whiskey, the sharpened blades, the shallow graves marked with only a stone. They spoke of the families destroyed, of the fathers and brothers who never returned home. But Miriam never flinched. Instead, when she was granted a moment to speak, she uttered words that silenced the entire courtroom. "You call me a monster because I hunted men, yet men have hunted women since the beginning of time. I merely turned the hunt upon them." Those words ignited chaos. Some gasped in horror. Others clapped their hands before the judge could silence them. Even the jury seemed shaken, for her logic cut deep into a truth society wished to ignore. But the law could not bend to rhetoric, no matter how sharp. After weeks of arguments, testimonies, and whispered fears, the verdict was declared guilty of multiple murders. The punishment, death by hanging. Yet even as the sentence was read aloud, Miriam's lips curled into that unsettling smile. She did not beg, did not cry, did not falter. Instead, She whispered, audible only to the guards near her. "They will not bury me, they will bury themselves." Her fate was sealed, but her legend had only begun to take shape. For whispers already circulated that Miriam Blackwell would not meet death as others did. Something darker waited on the gallows. The 30th revelation strikes like a hammer blow, not because of its suddenness, but because of its inevitability. By now, the pattern is undeniable. Every disappearance in Hollow Creek was not random, not coincidental, but threaded with purpose. Each victim was chosen, not for wealth, not for beauty, not for social standing, but for silence. Those who questioned the doctrines, those who whispered doubts about the sermons, those who resisted the suffocating rules of the community, they were marked. The Hollow Creek religious community did not merely demand obedience. It demanded the complete erasure of self. A doctrine was whispered only among the highest-ranking members. The voice of the doubter is the voice of the devil, and the devil must be cut out. It was not metaphor. It was literal instruction. Hidden beneath the chapel, where chants once echoed like prayers, was a vault, a chamber the elders called the Chamber of Correction. Testimonies from defectors spoke of crude wooden stocks, of hooks drilled into stone walls, of voices begging for release. The elders claimed these were tools of purification, but the truth was far darker. Those who entered seldom walked back into the light. And yet, the community did not stop at silencing the body. They erased the memory of the vanished. In sermons, the missing were never named. Families were told their loved ones had wandered into the wilderness, claimed by the devil. No search parties, no records, just silence. And in a town bound by faith and fear, silence was compliance. But the terrifying detail unearthed in forgotten ledgers and private notes is this. The disappearances occurred in cycles, every 7 years. And on each cycle, the number grew. First 2, then 5, then 11, until finally, the count stood at 312 across 27 years. The ledger ends abruptly in the year of the fire, when the chapel itself burned to ash. Yet survivors whispered of what the flames did not consume. They said beneath the rubble, the Chamber of Correction remained untouched. Its stone walls blackened, its air filled with the stench of something that refused to die. The most damning question remains: who ordered the cycles? A single man drunk with power, or an entire council, acting as one? Records point to the Council of Seven, a body of elders who guided the flock. Their signatures appear again and again, approving purchases of ropes, locks, chains, and wood for ritual purposes. But no document admits to what those rituals truly were. And now, as historians and seekers of forbidden truths peer deeper, they begin to realize something more chilling. The system Hollow Creek built was not unique. It was a prototype, a design later mirrored by institutions across the world, quietly, subtly, always in the name of obedience. 312 was not the end. It was the beginning of a pattern. The chilling atmosphere within the Hollow Creek community was never fully contained by its towering fences or its leader sermons. It began to seep out, slowly but steadily, into the surrounding towns. Farmers reported seeing lanterns glowing deep in the woods at night, in places where no sane man would walk. Hunters swore they heard voices carried on the wind, low, guttural chants, always just beyond earshot. Children who strayed too close to the Hollow Creek borders returned silent, pale, and unable to describe what they had seen. Something was moving, something ancient, and it was not bound only to the compound anymore. Authorities received complaints, but each was dismissed or redirected. Some say Hollow Creek leaders had friends in the local courts, men whose pockets were lined with favors and quiet offerings. Others believe the government wanted the community left alone, because what grew inside Hollow Creek served a purpose, an experiment in silence, obedience, and disappearance. It was easier to let 312 vanish across decades than to shine a light on what was happening behind the chapel doors. The chilling part is this: disappearances outside Hollow Creek began to mirror those within. Young men and women went missing in nearby towns. Families woke to find entire barns burned in the night with no tracks, no sound, no explanation. Reports noted strange markings etched into doors and gates, markings almost identical to the sigil carved into the pulpit of Hollow Creek's church. The infection of fear spread outward like a disease. Some whispered of bargains being made, that Hollow Creek's leaders were not merely priests or community elders, but emissaries of something older, something that demanded offerings. And when the children and adults, taken from within the fences, were not enough, the hunger spilled into the outer world. The number 312 was never a random sum. It was part of a cycle, a fulfillment of an agreement carved into blood and shadow. Imagine living near Hollow Creek in those years. Imagine watching your neighbor's son vanish, knowing the community only a mile away kept its doors locked tight, its fires burning through the night. Would you dare ask questions? Or would you do what the surrounding towns did? Stay silent, pray, and hope the darkness passed you by? But here's the terrifying reality. Silence never saved anyone. Hollow Creek's influence didn't fade. It adapted, spreading its roots deeper, until the line between inside and outside no longer existed. The trial of Lady Evelyn Blackwell was unlike anything England had ever seen. The courtroom swelled with tension, journalists scribbled furiously, and crowds pressed against the wooden rails, desperate to glimpse the woman who had haunted their nightmares for decades. She arrived veiled in black, her posture rigid, her expression unreadable. It was as if the decades in hiding had not aged her, but preserved her in some unnatural stasis, her presence more spectral than mortal. The prosecution painted her as a predator cloaked in wealth and refinement. They read aloud the testimonies of servants who had seen children brought into the estate, only to vanish without a trace. They produced fragments of evidence from the ruins of the Blackwell Manor, chains, scorched clothing, and bones buried deep beneath the floorboards. Witnesses spoke of her voice, calm and cold, as she dictated the rituals of suffering within those walls. Yet when her defense rose, the case took on an eerie turn. Evelyn's lawyers leaned into the inexplicable, weaving her crimes into the tapestry of madness and superstition. They argued that she was not a killer, but a victim of hysteria, an aristocratic woman blamed for the decay of a family name. They suggested the servants lied for money, that the bones belonged to paupers buried long before Evelyn's time, that the accusations had grown into legend through rumor and fear. The audience listened, but a shadow hung over the proceedings, a sense that the defense was appealing to logic while the truth was buried in something far darker, far older. Throughout it all, Evelyn herself rarely spoke. When she did, her words chilled the room. "You speak of innocence and guilt as though you know what they mean," she said softly, her voice carrying like a whisper from a crypt. "But there are truths this court will never understand. There are debts older than your loss, and those debts must be paid." Some swore her eyes glowed when she said it. Others claimed it was only the flicker of candlelight. But the effect was undeniable. The room fell into a silence so heavy that even the judge hesitated to continue. The trial stretched for weeks, the evidence mounting, the testimonies damning. But beneath it all was an unspoken dread. If Lady Evelyn was guilty, then the Blackwell family was not merely a cursed bloodline, but a deliberate construction of horror. And if she was innocent, then who, or what, had truly orchestrated the deaths of so many innocents? The verdict was looming, but whispers filled the streets of London. Some said Evelyn would not live to see her sentence. Others swore the Blackwell name would never allow itself to be judged by mortal law. Night bleeds into memory, and memory into silence. The story of the Blackthorne family is not merely one of genetic horror. It is the story of how entire communities can bury their sins under the pretense of survival. What began as whispers about a cursed family line spiraled into a generational nightmare, a web of secrecy that no outsider dared to untangle. The children born to that name were not simply victims of biology. They were victims of a legacy, of an inheritance no one would willingly claim. By now, You've walked through their corridors, seen the dim light flicker against the walls of Raven Shade, and heard the echoes of voices that never found peace. What's most chilling is not the deformities, the silence of authorities, or the strange patterns in their births. What unsettles the soul is the simple realization that none of this was hidden well enough. People knew. Neighbors whispered. Priests prayed louder on Sundays. Doctors scribbled notes, burned them, and looked the other way. Society chose silence. And in that silence, horror flourished. The Blackthorns were not just a family. They were a mirror, a reflection of humanity's ability to excuse cruelty when it is dressed in mystery, to ignore suffering when it feels inconvenient, and to accept monstrosities as long as they remain confined behind someone else's door. Ask yourself, how many families, how many towns, how many communities carry secrets just as dark, hidden under the thin veil of tradition or necessity? This is where the story ends, but also where it begins again. Because the blood of Raven Shade, the whispers of the Blackthorns, and the questions they left behind still haunt the soil where their house once stood. Maybe the curse wasn't genetic. Maybe it was something deeper, something carried not in blood but in the shadows of human fear, greed, and denial. And if that is true, then the Blackthorn family was not unique. They were only the first to be noticed. The silence after their name faded was not peace. It was erasure. And erasure is the most dangerous curse of all. Now, I leave you with this thought. If one family's history could be buried so deep, what else lies hidden in the dark corners of our past, waiting for someone brave or foolish enough to dig it up? Subscribe to DeadScroll, because stories like this are only the beginning. The question is not whether you want to know the truth. The question is, can you handle it when it finds you?